This view is by no means to widely be discovered by scientific analysis. This view is by no means so held in contemporary post-behavioral circles. Not only do post-behavioralist concept accept that theory must play a central role in social analysis, they also recognize the possibility that different theoretical perspectives might generate different observation. Obviously, this possibility rendered the task of subjecting rival theories to empirical testing rather more complicated. According to post-behavioral, however, it does not render the task any less necessary. Whatever observation his theory may engender, if it is to be considered a truly explanatory theory, it must generate falsifiable predictions that are not contradictory by the available empirical evidence. For behavioralists and their modern post-behavioral counterpart, the main purpose of social scientific inquiry is to explain behavior at individual and aggregate level. The central question that behavioralists ask is, why do individual, institutional across and nation state behave the way they do? Embedded in the behavioralist notion of explanation is the idea of causality. Although behavioralists are aware that causality may be as such a reflection of the way we think about the world as it of reality, they nonetheless insist that unless a theory makes some sort of causal statement and cannot be deemed to explain everything, they also insist that if an explanation is to be believed, it must make empirical falsifiable prediction that can be tested against observation. While it is never possible definitely to establish that particular causal relationship exists, it is possible to determine how far a particular set of empirical observation is consistent with the specific proposition that link different phenomena together. For behavioralists, in short, believable explanatory theory must be capable of receiving and must receive empirical support. Post-behavioralists argue with considerable justification that nearly all social researchers who work with empirical material subscribe broadly to this view. In this sense, the legacy of behavioralism among empirical researchers is enormous. In many respects, we are all post-behavioralists now. Further readings. The list which follow provide an outline of tests that both employ and offer critique of the behavioral approach to social explanation. The best introduction of the philosophy of science in general and to behavioralism place within it. Chalmers 1985. For various critics and related ideas, see Winch 1958, Redner 1966 and Thomas 1979. On positivism and scientific approach to social explanation, more generally see Kuhn 1970, Hampel 1965-66, Hansen 1958, Halfpenny 1982 and Chalmers 1990. On the philosophical origin of behavioralism, see Carnap 1936-1950, Slink 1974 and Ayer 1971. For a useful explanation of some of the terms used in these studies, see Lackey 1976. For justification of quantitative approach to the analysis of empirical evidence in the social science, see Blalock 1964, 1969, 1970, 1972 and King 1989. For a recent summary of a way in which qualitative data can be employed within the behavioral scientific approach, see King 1994. Thank you. Hope you understand the chapter.
History and interpretation of text. Hermeneutics, the art of interpretation, takes its name from Hermes. In Greek mythology, Hermes was a winged foot messenger of the god and something of a trickster to boot. Like the Sphinx and oracle in Delphi, He relayed the messages from the god in an encoded and elusive way, typically in the form of riddles, leaving it to his human hearers to interpret the meaning and significance of any message. Sometimes they got it right and sometimes not, often with disastrous results. Students of political theory do not attempt to decode and interpret the meaning of messages of divine origin, but we do, of necessity, attempt to understand messages sent by us by long dead and all too human thinkers whose works we read and ponder and mine for meaning. Thus, political theory is in important ways a backward looking enterprise. A very considerable part of its subject matter is its own history, which consists of classic works from Plato onwards. In this respect, political theory is quite unlike, say, physics. One can be a very fine physicist without ever having studied the history of physics and having read Aristotle's physics or the Ionian nature philosophers, or for that matter, the works of Galileo and Newton. The same cannot be said of political theory. A student of political theory must have read, reread, and reflected upon the works of Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rossi, Marx, Mill, and many others if she is to competent in her chosen vocation. But there is more than one way to read, interpret, and understand the works that comprise the canon, changing and contested as it is of political theory. My aim in this chapter is to say something about the variety and diversity of approaches to the interpretation of text in political theory. I shall begin by noting the interpretation is not an option but but a necessity for the meaning seeking creatures that we are. Next, I shall sketch briefly the chief tenets of various schools of, or less formally, approaches to interpretation: Marxian, totalitarian, Freudian, feminist, Straussian, new historical, and postmodernist, and the interpretive controversies between and among them. Along the way, I shall supply several cautionary tales about how not to interpret particular passages from important thinkers, and finally, I conclude by presenting and defending my own pluralistic and problem driven approach to the interpretation of text in political theory. I want throughout to emphasize two points in particular: that not all interpretations are equally valid or valuable, and that interpretations are rationally criticizable and corrigible. The indispensability of interpretation. Interpretation comes with the territory of being human. It is an activity from which humans cannot escape. Our prehistoric ancestors interpreted the meanings of animals, entrails, omens, and other signs that might make their world more intelligible and perhaps portend their future. They, like modern meteorologists, attempted to forecast the weather by looking at clouds and observing the behavior of birds and other creatures. With the coming of literacy came the primacy of written over the spoken word. Religious people, then as now, interpret the meaning of sacred scriptures. Judges, lawyers, and ordinary citizens read and interpret constitution and other texts, and students of political theory read and adjudicate among rival interpretations of text in political theory. How one interprets the meaning of any text has implications for what one does with it. Hermeneutics can be, and often is, a deadly serious and sometimes simply deadly business. If you doubt it, you need only think of how Torquemada and Spanish Inquisition interpreted the Bible, or Lenin and Stalin, not to mention Mao and Pol Pot, the works of Marx or Hitler or the Nazis, writings of Nietzsche or Osama bin Laden and Islamic fundamentalists, the Quran, to see what carnage can result from interpretation of text taken to be foundational for mass movements. It is therefore important for students of political theory to treat the text they study not as sacred scripture but as the handiwork of human beings who, although fallible, have much to teach their critical readers. The vocation of political theory is in large part defined by its perennial fascination with and attention to classical works. Each generation reads them anew and from their own vantage point. These authors and their works comprise an important aspect of our political tradition, which we renew and enrich by reading, reflecting upon, and criticizing these works. And yet, to read and attempt to understand a work written a long time ago, perhaps in a different language, by an author whose mental differs remarkably from our own, is a daunting task. The reader finds herself in a position akin to that of an anthropologist studying an alien culture. As readers of works by Plato and other long dead authors, we find ourselves in an alien age or culture with whose concepts, categories, customs, and practices we are largely unfamiliar with. In such situation, we are often at a loss to know what is being said, much less why it is being said and what its meaning may be. We therefore need a translation not only of the words of the text but of its meaning. A good translation or interpretation is one that diminishes the strangeness of the text, making it more familiar and accessible to an otherwise puzzled or perplexed observer. The artifacts or texts produced in a political culture preceding and differing from our own do not readily reveal their meanings even to the most careful reader. To read a text over and over again as some advice is no doubt necessary, but it is hardly sufficient to enable us to arrive at anything like an adequate understanding of what, say, Plato meant by advocating the use of noble lies, and what Machiavelli meant by comparing fortune to a woman who must be beaten and bullied. To try to make sense of such puzzling terms and speech acts requires that we interpret their meaning. There is no understanding without interpretation, and no interpretation without the possibility of multiple misunderstandings or understandings. Nor is there a neutral standpoint or Archimedean point from which to interpret and appraise any text, classic or otherwise. All interpretation implies and originates in some vantage point or standpoint. Every interpretation, in short, implies an interest that provides the ground for and possibility of an interpretation. A standpoint from which inquiry can begin and interpretation proceed. These interests are, moreover, multiple and varied. One's interest can be contemporary. For example, can Mill still teach us about liberty? Or they may be more historical. Why did Mill's argument in On Liberty takes the form they did? Who were Mill's main targets and his intended audience? Or one's interest may be more narrowly linguistic or literary. What metaphors did Mill employ and with what effect? Or one's interest may be logical or philosophical. Is Mill's argument in On Liberty logically consistent? Are there gaps and lacunae in the argument? Is the argument convincing? None of the interest None of these interests necessarily exclude the others, but do dictate What will count as a problem? What constitutes an interesting or important question? And what method might be most appropriate and fruitful for answering such questions? One would not, for example, assess the logical adequacy of Mill's argument by examining the metaphors he uses, nor would one be able to answer questions posed from a historical perspective by looking only at the logical structure of his argument. What one's guiding interest might be and how one goes about answering to them is likely as not to depend on interpretive school to which one belongs. Schools of interpretation. There are today a number of influential schools of or approaches to interpretation. Each takes a distinctive approach to the history of political thought, and each is highly critical of the others. Disputes between and among these schools are heated and often protracted. I want now to offer brief thumbnail sketches of several approaches to interpretation. Marxian interpretation. I begin by considering the Marxian approach to textual interpretation. Marx famously remarked that ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the dominant or mainstream ideas of any era are those that serve the interest of the dominant class, largely by legitimating their preeminent position in society. So it comes as no surprise. Marxists say that in slave owning societies, slavery is portrayed and widely regarded as normal and natural. Aristotle said so in 4th century BC Greece, as did George Fitzhugh and other apologists for American slavery before the Civil War. In capitalist society, the free market is portrayed in the mainstream media, books, mass circulation magazines and newspapers, television, movies, as the most normal, natural, and efficient way to organize and run the economy. Other alternatives, such as socialism, are always portrayed negatively as abnormal, unnatural, and inefficient ideas, including those to be found in works of political theory, combined to form a more or less consistent set or system of ideas that Marx called an ideology. The point and purpose of any ideology is to lend legitimacy to the rule of the dominant class. Thus, ideologies serve as smoke screens, hiding tawdry reality from a credulous public and presenting a rosy, albeit false, picture of a society that treats all its members fairly, that rewards the deserving and punishes the undeserving, and distributes value goods in a just and equitable manner. For a Marxist, then, the task of textual interpretation is to get behind appearances, to uncover the reality they obscure, and to expose the Marx calls the illusion of that epoch. This general approach, which is now sometimes called the hermeneutics of suspicion, takes no statement at face value but views it as a stratagem or move in a game whose point is to obscure reality and legitimize existing power relations. An adequate or good interpretation is one that performs the function of ideology critique, that is, penetrates the veil of illusion and brings us closer to unveiling and exposing a heretofore hidden socio-economic reality. An example may serve to illustrate what this might mean in actual interpretative practice. One particularly important Marxian interpretation of key works in political theory is C.B. Macpherson's The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism. By possessive individualism, Macpherson means the political theory that serves to support or legitimize those mainstay of modern capitalism, economic self interest, and institution of private property. He finds Hobbes and Locke in particular to be ideologists and apologists for capitalism event later. Thus, Locke, for example, ceases to be the good, great, tolerant, proto democratic thinker we thought we knew and become instead an extraordinarily clever propagandist for the then emerging capitalist order. Macpherson makes much, for example, of Locke's discussion of private property in the second treatise of government. Locke's problem was to justify the institution of private property, particularly since the scripture says that God had given the earth to all mankind. How then could any individual make any portion of that common property his own? Locke famously answers that one separates one's own part from the common by mixing one's labor with it. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of this body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature has provided, and left it in he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, thereby makes it his property. Even so, Locke adds, there remains restrictions on how much one might justifiably remove from the common store. Namely, one may not take more than one can use without its spoiling. You might make apples from a commonly owned tree your own property by expending your labor, by climbing the tree, picking the apples, sorting and washing them, etc. But you are entitled to take no more apples than you can use without their spoiling. These use and spoilage limitations are overcome, however, with the introduction of money. And thus came in the use of money some lasting things that men might keep without spoiling, and that by mutual consent men would take in the exchange for the truly useful but perishable supports of life. And as different degrees of industry were apt to give men possessions in different proportions, so this invention of money gave them the opportunity to continue to enlarge them. Macpherson's make much of these passages, which he takes to represent a key junction in Locke's justification of capitalist accumulation and ever greater inequalities of wealth. Macpherson's critics contend that it is anything but that the Locke was a devout Christian who had deep misgivings about money, the love of which is said in the scriptures to be the root of all evil. That the word Locke used in the paragraph 48 is not property, that which is properly and by right your own, but possession which is mere fact without moral or legal import. A thief may possess your wallet which is not properly his, that is his property. Hence, the most we may conclude is that money and therefore presumably capital itself is a human institution about whose moral status Locke felt deeply ambivalent. A Marxian approach to textual interpretation encounters a number of difficulties, among them the following. We have seen already that Marxists assume that the ruling ideas of an epoch are those that serve the interest of the ruling class. And since most political thinkers have belonged to an educated and literate elite, their ideas served the ruling class, but then Marx and Engels and Lenin, Trotsky, Bukharin, Lukács, and many other prominent Marxists have not belonged to the class of oppressed laborers, but to a learned and literate elite. By Marxian lights, their ideas should serve the interest of the ruling capitalist class and not those of laboring proletariat. How can the ideas of the Marxists serve the interest of a class to which they do not belong? All attempts by Marx or others to answer this question, that there are some who through will or intellect transcend their objective class basis, that the workers cannot theorize for themselves because they are afflicted with false consciousness, whilst middle class intellectuals are not, are merely ad hoc rationalizations and are clearly unsatisfactory. Moreover, how Marxists can interpret all political theories, past and present, as ideological masks, concealing and justifying the domination of one class by another, and yet exempt their own theorizing as an exception to this rule, is not explained in any satisfactory way, and not least, Marxian interpretations have a formulaic, cookie cutter quality. The interpreter has preset ideas about what she will find, namely ideological trickery and obfuscation in the service of the ruling class, and presto, she finds it lurking in even the most innocent sounding passages. Totalitarian interpretations. The 20th century saw the rise of power and prominence in various totalitarian regimes and ideologies, among which fascism and communism were particularly prominent. One important and influential approach to textual interpretations views these ideologies as rooted in the thinking of earlier political theorists going as far back as Plato. These earlier theories, when put into modern political practice, allegedly produced Hitler and Holocaust and Stalin and Gulag. It was therefore deemed important to detect and expose the philosophical origins or roots of modern totalitarianism by rereading and reinterpreting earlier thinkers in light of the latter day fruits of their theorizing. Once one begins to look for proto totalitarian themes and tendencies in earlier theorists, they seem to be everywhere. What is Plato's perfect republic ruled by a philosopher king who employs censorship and noble lies, if not a blueprint for a Nazi regime ruled by an all knowing Führer, backed by propaganda and the big lie, or for a Soviet style communist utopia ruled by a Lenin or Stalin? Much, much the same might be said about Machiavelli's ruthless prince, or Hope's all powerful sovereign on Rousseau's all wise legislator. Indeed, Rosie's social contract has come in for special censure. Rosie's critics have viewed him as a precursor of totalitarianism for four main reasons. The first is his notion of the general will, which is always right and cannot X. The second is Rosie's chilling assertion that would be descendants dissidents must be forced to be free. The third is the ominous figure of the omniscient and godlike legislator. And the fourth and most frightening feature of Rosie's ideal republic is the civil religion that supplies a religious rationale for its draconian laws and institutions. Taken together, these four features constitute a bill of indictment of Rosie's totalitarian intentions. Other later thinkers, particularly Hegel and Marx, have been subjected to similar criticism. Among the most prominent representatives of the totalitarian approach to textual interpretation was the late Sir Karl Popper, whose The Open Society and Its Enemies is the most sustained and systematic attempt to trace the roots of modern totalitarianism to ideas advanced by enemies of open society from Plato to the Marx. An Austrian Jew who fled from the Nazis and immigrated to New Zealand in the 1930s, Popper regarded his research for and writing of the open society as his war effort. It may be instructive to revisit Popper's Open Society to show how sincerely held present day concerns can inform and misinform our interpretation of classic works in political theory. Let us choose from our preceding rogues gallery a single example of closer examination. Hegel's remark in Philosophy of Right that what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational. Popper quotes Hegel's remark in English translation and then glosses it as follows. Hegel maintains that everything that is reasonable must be real, and everything that is real must be reasonable. Thus, Hegel holds that everything that is now real or actually exists by necessity and must be reasonable as well as good. The Prussian state of Hegel's time was an authoritarian police state that practiced censorship, arbitrary arrest, and imprisonment without due process of law. That state was real, therefore, in Hegel's view, that state was rational or reasonable and thus good. In this way, Popper claims Hegel gave his philosophical blessings to the Prussian prototype of the modern totalitarian state, and so must himself be accounted a totalitarian thinker and apologist. Hegel is, in short, an enemy of the open society. But is Hegel guilty as charged? The short answer is no. Let us see why. Here is Hegel's own statement in the original German. Was vernünftig ist das ist wirklich and was wirklich ist das ist wortfling. The closest English equivalent is what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational. Note that wirklich is translated not as real but as actual. In everyday German, as in English, there is ordinarily no sharp distinction between real and actual. Popper, whose first language was German, fails to note that Hegel was writing not in ordinary non technical German but in a technical philosophical idiom. He draws and maintains a sharp distinction between wirklich, actual, and real. In Hegel's philosophical nomenclature, an acorn, for example, is real, but it is an actual until its potential is fully actualized. That is, when it becomes a full grown oak. In other words, Hegel uses wirklich to mean fully actualized. He contrasts actual not with unreal but with potential. Thus, Hegel's infamous statements mean something like what is rational is that which fully actualizes its potential, and what fully actualizes its potential is rational. This is far from being the sinister statement that Popper makes it out to be, and what he takes to be evidence from Hegel's totalitarian tendencies. There is larger hermeneutical lesson to be learned from Popper and many others' misreading of Hegel. First, it is important to place statements in their proper context, conceptual, philosophical, or otherwise. In this instance, that means taking note of how Hegel uses an apparently ordinary term in a non ordinary or technical way. Second, one should beware of any interpreter who, like Popper, has a preset thesis that he then proves by selectively quoting and stitching together statements taken out of their textual and linguistic context. A penchant Popper shares, ironically, with the Marxist he so detests. Psychoanalytic interpretation. In the interpretation of dreams, the psychopathology of everyday life, and other works, Sigmund Freud famously argued that our actions are often motivated by wishes and desires or fears of which are not consciously aware. Psychoanalytic interpretations, like Marxian ones, fall under the heading of the hermeneutics of suspicion. My apparently accidental slips of the tongue, for example, may reveal to a trained psychoanalyst aspects of my unconscious that are not evident to me. So too in my dreams. Suppose I dream that I am at bat in a baseball game, bottom of the ninth inning, with my team losing, all bases loaded, one ball and two strikes. Here comes the pitch. As I begin to swing, my bat suddenly turns rubbery and floppy, like one that a circus clown might swing. The ball whizzes past my ineffectual bat, and I strike out, losing the game for my team and bringing embarrassment and disgrace upon myself. How to interpret what have I dreamed? Well, if I were a baseball player who's afraid of cracking under pressure, the meaning of my dream would be pretty transparent. But alas, I'm not a baseball player. I am merely a 50 something male academic. An analyst might interpret this dream as a fear of losing sexual potency, particularly when there are high expectations and lot of pressure to perform. In this case, baseball game is not a game and the limp bat is not a bat but a symbol standing for something else. Well, you get the idea. One can supply psychoanalytic interpretations not only of dreams but of all sorts of text, including those in political theory. This has been done in the case of Machiavelli, Edmund Burke, Martin Luther, and Mahatma Gandhi, among others. I want to look more particularly at Bruce Maslish's psychoanalytic interpretation of themes in the work of John Stuart Mill. Mill is most famous as the author of On Liberty, in which he argues in favor of a very wide sphere of personal freedom to live one's life as one wishes, without undue interference from others, no matter how well meaning those others may be. Now, as Mill tells us in his autobiography, his stern Scots father James Mill did not permit his firstborn son to live and act as he wished. Young John was not allowed to associate with other children, to play games, or to do anything except to read, and be exactingly examined on books assigned by his father. The elder Mill's strict educational regimen was constructed and carried out with the best of intentions. That this tightly regimented upbringing produced impressive results but also took its toll. At age 20, John suffered a mental breakdown from which he recovered only slowly and in part through the reading of romantic poetry, of which his father heartily disapproved. From that point on, Mill ceased to be his father's intellectual clone. He became a thinker with a mind of his own and an author more prolific and more famous than his father. Mazalish interprets On Liberty less as a work of liberal political theory than as a cry de cure and a declaration of personal independence that is more autobiographical than analytical. Perhaps that's what Nietzsche means what he said that all theory is autobiography. This is not what Mill consciously intended, but he was led by unconscious desires to declare himself independent of his father, and some 23 years after his father's death to justify his own independence and autonomy. As Freud theorized, sons subconsciously wish to kill their fathers and possess their mothers. That is, he called the Oedipus complex. Mill was locked in a Oedipal struggle with his father, whom he defeated in argument. What then of his relations with his mother? Her name was Harriet. Significantly, as Maslish notes, Mill had an illicit affair with a married woman and mother named Harriet, who after her husband died became Harriet Taylor Mill. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this is strong stuff, and Mazalish makes the most of it. Although often suggestive and sometimes insightful, psychoanalytic interpretations face stiff evidentiary challenges. They are often to criticism that they are speculative, impressionistic, and falsifiable, and mistake coincides for causes. To the claim that Mill symbolically defeated his father and married his mother, for example, a skeptic might answer that Harriet was a very common woman's name in 19th century Britain, and that Mill's affair with and marriage to Harriet Taylor was a coincidence of no importance, symbolic or otherwise. As for Mill's motivation in writing on liberty, one can note that motivations are typically multiple and varied, and while Mazalish may have correctly pinpointed one source, that is largely beside the point if one wishes to understand the aim and argument of one library on liberty. Psychoanalytic interpretations direct our attention away from the text and towards its author, which is fine if what we wish to understand is the latter instead of the former. But textual interpretation is not the same thing as limiting authorial motivation. Mill begins on liberty by saying that the subject of this essay is the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. He does not say by fathers over sons to assert as Majlis does, and the latter is real, albeit hidden, meaning is to merely to speculate about Mill's motives, not to understand the argument of on liberty. It is perhaps because of these evident shortcomings that psychoanalytic interpretations have by and large fallen out of favor among students of political theory. Feminist interpretation. Feminism has had a profound and lasting impact on the way we study and interpret works in the history of political thoughts. A feminist perspective puts issues concerning gender at the forefront and puts the vantage point one view political theory anew and makes interesting and sometimes appalling discoveries. See further chapter 21. Such a sensibility injects a strong strain of skepticism into the study of classic works. For, as Susan Oken observes, the great tradition of political philosophy consists, generally speaking, of writings by men, for men, and about men. To study this tradition from a feminist perspective is to be struck by the extent to which the civic and legal status of women was long considered to be the subject unworthy of theoretical treatment, or perhaps merely beneath the theorist's contempt, and therefore outside the purview of historians of political thought, most of whom happen to be male. The neglect of women in the history of Western and indeed non Western political thought is a silence that, to modern ears, is deafening. Feminist rereadings and reappraisals of the canon of classic works have made and continue to make startling and often unsuspected connections between phenomena as apparently disparate as a thinker's view of the family and his view of liberty. Authority, power, equality, obligation, and other concepts in political theory. A feminist or gender centered approach to the history of political thought began in the 1960s when women were looking for a usable past and a history that connected present struggles with previous ones, largely neglected by historians, most of whom were male. Feminist historians of political thought sought heroines and heroes who had championed the cause of women's rights and related causes. One early anthology included not only selections from Mary Wollstonecraft, Emma Goldman, and others, but also a section on men as feminists, which placed Frederick Engels, John Stuart Mill, and other men in the feminist pantheon. This transgender popular front sought support from all available quarters.